Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Automotive Industry Outlook, Navigating Disruption in a Time of Industry Transformation and the New Stellantis 2022 Purchase Agreement Terms, sponsored by MINASF, NASF, IHS Markit, and Butzel. We'll be covering a lot of ground in this afternoon's presentation, so please feel free to submit questions to the presenters using the Zoom Q&A panel. Also, a copy of this presentation will be made available on the webinar event page on butzel.com. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to introduce Butzel's Director of Innovation and External Relations and shareholder, Beth Gotthelf, and our presenters, Mike Wall from IHS Markit and Everardo Tapia from Butzel. Beth?
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. I wear a lot of hats at Butzel. And one of my many hats is I'm general counsel to the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Surface Finishers. I'm also on their board because I failed to take a step backward when they were asking for, nominees and stuff. So just a lesson to you all. Don't miss meetings. And if you're there, remember to take a step backwards when they ask for volunteers. Just easy. So today we have two parts of our program, as Jonathan had mentioned. The first part is going to be Mike Wall is going to speak about the automotive outlook. And that is going to be from as soon as I'm done talking until about 3:45. After that, we'll have about 15 minutes questions and answers. And as just noted, use the Q&A in your chat box for any questions that you may have. And then after Mike's done at 4 o'clock, we're going to have Everardo speak about the terms and condition part. And that speech is going to be, I'll first introduce him, and then he's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes Q&A for him. So save your questions on terms and conditions until the second part, and get all your questions for the automotive outlook in the first part of this conversation. So that's just part of the housekeeping, and so you know what to expect. I also want to remind you, Jonathan mentioned that one of the sponsors is the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Surface Finishers, MINASF. We have a number of our board members on the call. Thank you, board members. Thank you, members. And thank you, Ellen McAloy, who is the executive director, and she's been fabulous. We really appreciated you. And our next event after this one is an in-person event on March 12th. We're going to have a technical session and a dance. It's going to be in Grand Rapids at the Bob. So if anybody needs information, contact me, contact Ellen, and we'll be sure to get that to you. So as I said, aside from being an attorney and being general counsel to the association, and I counsel a lot of other counsel clients on a lot of different things, especially as it relates to contracts, automotive, environmental, etc., aerospace and defense. And for the automotive, you often have questions, and what's going on? What's the next thing we're going to see? And I have to tell you, one of the most popular events that we have is our automotive outlook. And we've asked Mike Wall now to speak a number of times because he does such a phenomenal job. Mike is the executive director of automotive analysis for IHS Markit. He's been there for about 25 years, over 2 decades. We won't age him too much. And he gives us a lot of, the financial analysis, the forecasting, some of the manufacturing experiences, and, with the automakers and a lot of suppliers. In fact, he's come on to talk to, we're great because he's usually talks to us during auto show. So he goes speaking to, the tier 1 or some of the larger clients, and then he comes to speak to all of us. And some of you have used him privately for some of the services that they offer to help you with what you're going to do and to plan your future. So he's been terrific to us, and it's kind of cool to have him when you're somebody who, you know, is quoted in the paper and often interviewed, and yet he always has time for us, and we greatly appreciate it. And so with that big introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to speak a little bit. So
Great.
you should have your...
Be sharing my screen now. Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction. It is always appreciated. And I always love presenting at this event. I love it more when it's in person. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to be in person with everyone again in the not too distant future. I'm starting to see some pickup on that front. I'm actually speaking to you from our Southfield office in Detroit, I'm based over on the west side of Michigan. So my heart and passion is with the supply chain. So absolutely, I work with automakers, I work with financial clients, but I work the most with suppliers, and I love it all. I love it all day. So with that, let's get into this discussion. Boy, you know, these last two plus years have been a wild ride. We're navigating some treacherous waters. We continue to do that. You know, we get thrown curveballs. We're going to kind of go through the latest outlook. You know, what's facing the industry. Where are we with chips? Where are we with you know, what's happening with Putin and the Ukraine, and how that might impact and influence the industry. Let's set the stage, though, to start the conversation around the economic environment. How we forecast, and I've talked this before, top down and bottom up. That top down starts with those economic drivers that can influence consumer demand, industrial production, and the like. The interesting thing right now, in the 25 plus years I've been covering this industry, we're kind of turned on our head right now. Usually it's vehicle demand influences vehicle production and informs vehicle production. We're not in that environment right now. It's upside down. It's vehicle production is driving vehicle demand. So it's something we're still navigating through, absolutely, even as we speak. But from an economic perspective, GDP growth this year, we're starting to decelerate. You know, last year, if you look at global GDP growth, we're around 5.7%. That's about similar for the US as well. Heavily stimulus influenced, certainly stimulus driven, to be sure. But by the same token, that stimulus is starting to wear off. We're starting to see a little bit more of a return to meet the averages, even though we're still running above trend. You know, this year globally will be at about 4.1% from a global perspective. From a US perspective, we'll be at around 3.7%. Still positive. But now we have to keep our eyes on inflation, interest rates that will be going up here in the not too distant future, and now some of the geopolitical threats that are out there. You know, I'm mindful of the fact it wasn't that long ago that Russia was exerting its influence in the Ukraine not that long ago, and now we have them doing it again. And how that might inform vehicle sales. The irony is, again, demand is there in many markets, including the US. We just can't produce enough. And we'll get into some of the dynamics associated with that. But from an economic perspective, again, starting to decelerate from last year, but still running above trend. And that's certainly still conducive to vehicle demand and supportive of vehicle demand. Now, when we look at global light vehicle sales here, and again, the tail of the tape is tough, obviously coming off of 2019 and going through COVID in 2020, we've entered about 13 million units of sales globally. And the probably even more challenging than that and more frustrating than that, the industry in the US in particular, and China as well, I would say, was poised for a V-shaped recovery. We had a consumer base that was running back to vehicles in no short order in 2020, even by mid 2020. The problem was we evolved from sort of a pandemic influence, and we still are impacted by the pandemic, of course, but it became clearly a supply chain crisis, which it transitioned. And that resulted in only about 3 million units of growth last year to 80 million units. And frankly, this year, we're still kind of in the thick of it. This is going to be a transitional year, about another 3 million units of global growth. Growth nonetheless, but more modest growth. It's a transitional year till we get to next year. Again, 2023, we do expect there to be, certainly more robust available of components to even support certainly the demand that's out there. We'll get to those pre-COVID levels, about 90 million units. Intermediate to longer term, as we start seeing some of those emerging markets taking off, we do expect to get to that 100 million unit range. It is much further out in our forecast horizon towards the tail end of our current forecast horizon. It's definitely the near-term dynamics that are weighing heavily right now. Now, from a production perspective, I've said this for some time, COVID and the impacts in 2020, I dare say, were much more impactful to production than sales even. And again, in many markets, those consumers came back to market at a much more rapid clip. And it makes some sense. We were homebound, flush with cash in many cases, and looking to spend that money, and you couldn't go travel. There were areas where you couldn't spend. And yet in many metropolitan markets, you wanted a vehicle. You didn't want to take public transportation. You wanted that mobility, that freedom of mobility. So the demand was there, production was not there. And again, in 2020, we saw a contraction of about 16%. Last year, we eked out a little bit of a gain, 2021, about 3%. But again, it's this transitional time period. 2022, we're looking for a bit more growth from a production standpoint. And again, we need to start refilling the inventory pipeline. There's a lot of work ahead of us on that, but we're looking at global production of about 84 million units this year. And again, when we go out to 2023 is when we start getting closer to those pre-COVID volumes. 2023, we're looking at 91 million units. We still have a lot of work to do, particularly on the supply chain side, and it's particularly focused still around semiconductors. This is going to be a recurring theme. I have a number of slides on this topic specifically, and not to beat a dead horse by any stretch, but to let everybody know in the audience that it is a complicated conversation. We say semiconductors like it's this ubiquitous component. Give me a box of semiconductors. I'm going to punch out a bunch of vehicles. It's not even quite as easy as that either. And that's not all that easy. There's a concept around what are called analog chips versus the more advanced multi-controllers. And those multiple multi-controllers are certainly in much stronger, I shouldn't say stronger supply, they're being invested in a much more rapid clip. And we use the MCUs in our vehicles, to be sure, and a lot of the advanced componentry, but we use a lot of the old school analog chips. Those are going to be a critical choke point. And we're already seeing that. And why is that? We've got a number of factors at play. Number of chips per car, and you'll see in a moment, has really exploded. And it's kind of cliche to say that. Kind of makes sense if you think about the technology in the vehicles, but when you see it in stark contrast, you'll see in a moment just how important that's been. You look at the mismatch between production and demand, and something we're still struggling with is sort of this toilet paper effect. We've got a lot of automakers and suppliers saying, give us all the chips you got, Mr. and Mrs. Chip Manufacturer. The chip manufacturer is saying, not so fast. You're asking for more chip production than you've ever used, even in the good old days. There's something not right there. There's not an alignment. We need an alignment there. That will come as the year progresses, particularly as we get to the back half of the year. But we still have some work to do with the disparate groups there. Total capacity for chip fabrication. This is a big deal. What do we mean by this? Again, we have those analog chips versus those more advanced MCUs. Of the CapEx spend that's going on, only about 12% is going to analog capacity and analog chip production versus the MCUs. And we need that advanced chip manufacturing, to be sure. But the concern there is we follow the money and follow the CapEx spend. We're worried there's going to be some additional headwinds, ceilings, if you will, particularly as it relates to the analog chips. I'll get into that in a moment as well. And then, of course, the classic allocation of chip manufacturing to automotive. We're continuing to do battle with the consumer electronics and other industrial categories as well. It's going to be something the industry is going to have to navigate. Quick slide here. This is something we yell at and we talk to our semiconductor analysts all the time. And I'm not a semiconductor expert by any means. We have a number of analysts on staff, and we'll say, how is it possible in 2017 we built 95 million vehicles, but in 2021 we can only build 75 million? What gives? How is that even possible? And then they quickly pull out this slide and say, well, the world's a little different, 2021 versus 2017. And indeed it is, in terms of the average number of chips have almost doubled in terms of the usage in vehicles. And frankly, it's only going to get, call it worse or even more intense as we see more electrified vehicles coming on the pike as well. So this is something that's weighing heavily on the industry writ large. Now, on the good news side, this isn't all bad news. Good news, here we take a look at our production disruption. So this is on a weekly basis, how much disruption is going on at OEM automaker assembly plants. And you could see in Q3 and into early Q4, that disruption was heavy. We were seeing some pretty heavy weekly disruption. That's subsided. And again, that aggregate impact is tipping at about 10 million units. Now that's a huge number to be sure, but you can see the ramp up was really in late Q2 and into Q3 and even early Q4. That has improved. We see some improvement on the disruption front. Now, here's the other challenge. As we're bringing these plants back online, we're not bringing them back at 100% capacity utilization. So there are still some challenges there, some short shifting going on, things like that. But by the same token, that those mass disruption events are at least much more so in the rearview mirror. That's a positive, good takeaway on this front. Now, one other positive here as well, and this is a bit of a busy slide, but on the top line is our light vehicle production forecast, our latest forecast. The blue line is our analog chip shipments that our semiconductor team tracks. And then the gray line are the chip usage that they're able to infer based on our vehicle production forecast. And those are generally kind of in alignment, except here recently, as we got into the latter part of 2021, we built up what we feel has been a little bit of an inventory of those analog chips. We think it's a one-time event, but it makes sense when we saw going on in South Asia, when we saw some of those lockdowns in Q3, it really impacted that back-end processing. Well, as those lockdowns faded, the back-end processing could kick back into gear, and it processed a lot of those chips that were starting to develop as a backlog. That's great news. It's giving us maybe a little bit of a short-term respite, and we're gonna definitely lean on that. It's not necessarily going to be a long-term tailwind, but it's something that can certainly help support production even into 2022 as we think about that. Now, in the intermediate term, when we start thinking about 23 and 24, what's kind of predicated or baked into our forecast is we do think we're running into a bit of a bumping our head on a ceiling as it relates to analog chip capacity in particular. And again, here, the solid line is our forecast, our vehicle forecast. And then the green dash line and the red dash line are sort of some implied analog chip, call it capacity, at an optimistic and a more conservative view. We're kind of in our forecast, especially get out to late 23 and into early 24, kind of bumping our head at what we feel is kind of the optimistic bandwidth as it relates to analog chip capacity. So something to think about, there is, while as we get back to quote unquote normal, in order to really accelerate and grow further, particularly in the US and North America, particularly in Asia, where demand is there, it's going to take some additional investment, particularly in those analog chipsets. We're watching that very closely. It's something that we want to make sure suppliers are attuned to when they start thinking about production and planning volumes in 23 and 24 as well. With that, let's turn and look at a couple of international markets before we really dig in deep into North America and the US. Mainland China, we saw a couple of years of contraction in 19 and 20. That really came off of another year contraction in 18 as well. Last year, we saw at least some better growth, about 5%, not where it should have been. They were impacted. China was impacted certainly by the supply chain pressures. And in fact, this year is going to be flat-ish. We've got growth, almost 2% of growth. But again, it's still a challenge. We've still got semiconductor issues that are impacting China. And you may have seen certainly some of the power shortages and things like that are weighing on the broader supply chain and even in the industrial base as well. Those are some also factors that we have to think about as it even influences vehicle production in the market until we get to some broader recovery, which is really going to be more 2023 and 2024 again. And then as we get to 24 and 25, we start getting closer to that 30 million unit number for China proper, which is certainly a big positive for them in terms of production growth. Now, from a Europe perspective, and this is Europe excluding some of those Eastern Bloc countries, so think West Europe and Turkey in particular, they were arguably a bit more impacted going through the COVID situation. 2020 production down almost 23%. We saw kind of successive reopening and then lockdowns in the broader European market. And that certainly had an impact to production for sure, but even demand. Now, as you flash forward to last year, we're down about 5.7%. And again, it was kind of fits and starts last year. Supply chain was also impactful. Going into this year, we do expect to see some more meaningful growth off of a weak base, to be sure, and not back to pre-crisis levels. That's really the unique thing about Europe as opposed to North America and China, whereas 2023 is more of a kind of a closer return to pre-COVID. It's going to be more of a 2024 story for a return to pre-COVID in Europe. And again, a lot of that's going to be predicated on still some fairly sluggish demand fundamentals in Europe as we start to get to be more demand influenced in the market. Production will somewhat be supported by some export activity going to the US and going to China, but it is still a challenge in the sense that we need to start to see more sustainable demand recovery in that market. So there's still some room to grow there yet. It's going to take a little bit longer. Now let's spin and talk about the US and North America. I've got a number of slides to really dig in deep here. And I know a lot of the suppliers on this call are particularly focused on North America. So I want to make sure I give it its due. Light vehicle sales outlook. Here we take a look at, I've got two different data points here. The solid line is our latest January forecast for sales. The dashed line is our July forecast. And the stark contrast there is in July was sort of the last month of our forecast where we had a different growth profile. Because frankly, we saw the semiconductor situation deteriorate further in sort of that August, September timeframe. We saw those successive lockdowns in Malaysia really crimp and impact available chip capacity. And what it's doing, it's stretched out the demand story in the US. So we went from the mid 16 million unit range for 2022 to 15.5 million units for 2022. So we did have to give it a haircut. Last year, we did about 15.1 million units in terms of sales. Now, the good news, and we try to draw some good news out of this isn't all lost demand. Probably now more so than ever. The used vehicle market is on fire as well. There's not nearly as much inventory as there used to be in the used market. And that inventory that is there is older, higher miles, and maybe not as great condition. So what that's doing is you're not seeing as much of a switching effect. Yes, we certainly are having some folks skipping from new to used when they can't get a new vehicle, but it's in more, maybe call it dire circumstances where it's a need to have rather than I desire to have or a want to have. Some of that is being pent up and deferred. And we see that deferral into 2024 and 2025. Now, again, not every unit of deferred sales are recovered or are pent up and recoverable. But we do feel there's a meaningful amount, and that's captured in there. Also watch daily rental. Daily rental has been a market that's been underserved. They've had to go to the used car market themselves. Think of the Hertz and Avis and Enterprise and the like. Many of them have had to go to the used car market because they can't get new vehicle allocations. That is something that we do think is going to give us a bit of a tailwind as well once we start getting that supply side equilibration hitting the market here, especially as we get to next year and the following year. Now, one thing to keep our eyes on, and we'll be talking about electrification a bit more later on as well, but here we look at, from a US vehicle sales perspective, the model count as it relates to electrified vehicles, so full electric vehicles. And I'm telling you, it's about to go parabolic here. You look at 2022, we've got about 63 vehicles this year that will be sold that are electric, full electric vehicles. We need to roll in the Tesla product and a bunch of other new launches that are coming on throughout the year. But by 2026, we'll be at almost 200 vehicles sold in the US that are electrified. So that model count is really getting ready to go up significantly. There's going to be a lot more opportunity, a lot more quoting opportunity. We'll talk about that in the North American production section, but it's also creating a lot of fragmentation. So think about that as we start to see those planning volumes coming from the automakers and really some of the general planning volumes around electrified and even the total volume sales as well. That's certainly baked into our forecast as well. Now, it goes without saying, this is kind of an obvious slide, but it shows the stark contrast. The area part of the slide are inventory units on the ground at dealer lots. And then the line is a sort of an inventory activity measure, if you will, inventory over sales. And boy, I mean, it unprecedented kind of comes up a lot in this business right now, but we're at historically low levels of inventory. It goes without saying. And obviously we can go to any dealer and see that, the lack of product. It's sticking. Right now we're in this situation until we really see a meaningful inflection up in production. We're kind of selling vehicles off the truck and off the next truck, if you will. Now, I will say in an average 16.5, 17 million unit year, in days gone by, it wouldn't be uncommon to see 3.5, maybe even 4 million units of inventory out there. I do think coming out of this, the industry is going to learn to work with less inventory. It's an easy thing to say, and I think it's easy to say, well, we're going to go back to the old days because we don't learn other lessons, but I think this has been an exercise for automakers where seeing the profit and the margin that's been afforded from having a leaner inventory. Now, 900,000 units is way too lean. So I'm not saying that. But I do think we're going to get to a case of where maybe you're in the old days again, the average days on hand would be 66, 65, 66 days. I could definitely see that in the 50-day, low 50-day range even. It could even be even lower for select models as well. So I do think we'll see more of that activity. But even with that said, we've got some room to run. We've got some making up to do in terms of production to rebuild inventory levels, because it's lean everywhere right now, and it remains lean. Now, from a production standpoint, again, let's draw the bitter medicine is the last 2 years have been terrible. 13 million units in 2020, 13 million units in 2021. Any way you color it, it's ugly. Could have been worse in 2020, sure. Could the wheels have completely fall off if demand completely collapsed? Sure, it could have been a bit worse, but still 13 million units, 2 years straight of it, it's tough. Especially in the midst of last year in particular, with raw material prices skyrocketing, continued labor availability challenges. It's a successive amount and degree of challenges. Now, the good news to start drawing out of this is in 2022, we do expect to add about 2 million units of production this year to about 15.2 million units. Now, again, the glass half empty is it should be closer to 17 million or better. But the glass half full, we've got about 2 million units incremental coming into the coffers this year. And we do expect that. I mean, we're starting to see some of that trajectory improve, especially you get to the back half of the year. Now, as you go out to 2023, that's when we do expect to start to get closer, get into that 17 million unit range. And again, the impetus is there through demand and through, again, that pent up demand. Even when we factor in, and again, there are headwinds. Inflation is something we're going to have to keep our eye on. It is the issue. Pricing in general is not going to be sustainable at $45,000, $46,000 transaction prices. You're going to see some equilibration there. And interest rates are going up, will be going up. So there's going to be some balance to that. But demand is so under supported right now, or we've got so much gap between production and demand and actual demand. We do believe we're going to be able to make up for that and that production will help to support that, and that there is more of that demand that is sustainable in this intermediate term in particular. Now, we'd like to throw out scenarios out there. I think scenarios are often very helpful to have for planning. And boy, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. We have so many arrows we have to dodge in a given time. It's easy to have a point in time forecast, but boy, you turn the dial on any sort of metric out there, could go up or could go down. So let's talk about that for a moment. This is particularly in the context of semiconductor and supply chain. What if we're able to outperform in terms of semiconductors and chip availability and supply chain in general? This year we're looking at just north of 16 million units. So there is upside potential. And we do weight the upside and downside risk at about the same right now, about 25% probability. Now there is a downside risk. We see maybe COVID flare-ups that radically maybe ratchet down the supply chain or disrupt the supply chain further. And of course, that can have a more meaningful impact to production this year, and frankly, even more meaningful impact to next year as well versus our baseline forecast. So again, there's some upside and downside scenarios I wanted to leave you with, just as you're thinking about your planning and in the go forward planning forecasts you may be doing. Now, when we look at production by country, I've shown this before, and the trends are sticking in a good way, in many cases in a good way, and I think those opportunities are still there. When I look at production by country, North American production by country, one thing sticks right out is the U.S. is poised between 2019 and 2029 to grow by almost 1 million units. We've got new capacity coming on board in the U.S., particularly the U.S. South. We've got some incremental localization going on for automakers, and then incremental capacity coming online for electric vehicles. So it's definitely a positive there for the US. Mexico, growth of about 100,000 units. This one's been a bit more volatile. We've seen some kind of investment not necessarily come and go, but the scoping of the size of the investment and the size of the capacity has been a bit more volatile, but growth nonetheless in Mexico. Canada is a wild card. Completely throw that out there to be honest, right from the beginning. We've got contraction of about 660,000 units between 2019 and 2029 in Canada. I think a big asterisk there is, or a caveat is, there's a heavy investment push in electrified vehicles in Canada, to their credit. So there is going to be a lot of opportunity, potential opportunity. A lot of that is going to be governed by the take rate, the adoption curve, if you will, for consumers on electrified vehicles. And we'll get into that in a moment. We do expect there to be a decent adoption curve, but that inflection and that slope of the curve is going to determine, I think, just how successful Canada is going to be in this intermediate term in particular, and where that growth is going to come from. Now we look at production by automaker type. I've shown this before as well, but there are some new trends kind of evolving. Again, I've talked about this before. 2019 was the first year we got to parity between the transplants and the Detroit 3. It's off to the races for the transplants now in terms of a majority producer, but the Detroit 3 are going to be left with a core hub of vehicle production at 8 million, 7.6, 7.7 to 8 million units, very highly profitable truck and utility vehicle, and increasingly electrified vehicles as well. So certainly positive business cases to be quoting to. And then the transplants, we've got, again, more localization, more white space categories as well. And then that burgeoning blue area are the startups. And I don't want to leave them out. They are critically important. You're likely being asked to quote on business with them. So we wanted to make sure we had some coverage here as well. And again, this is our latest forecast for all the various, not all of the startups, admittedly, not all of them are on here, because there are some that are maybe not quite ready for prime time. We're not quite ready to forecast them yet. But boy, from Arrival to Zoox, from A to Z, we do have a number of new startups in here. Now, we kind of include Tesla and the startups in that slide before. I don't include them on this slide because they'd knock the scale right off. To their credit, much credit to Tesla on that front. But when you look at the rest of the players, Rivian certainly stands right out. Obviously, they got the truck out there, R1T, R1S is out there, is coming out as well, as running as well. In the core heart of that market, again, light truck, heavy demand and high degree of consumer demand in that sector. So much for so on the truck side, pickup truck side, we're seeing other entrants coming into the market, including some of our established players as well, and some pretty solid demand, call it demand notes for consumers on that front as well. You got Lucid Motors certainly in there as well, taking more of a Tesla stage one type of approach, early days Tesla, focusing on particularly on passenger car electrification. We do expect certainly them to start to inflect upward as well, particularly as you get into 2024 and 2025, but at a different level than certainly Rivian. And then again, I'll leave this slide for everyone. Again, the folks at Butzel and the Surface Finishers Association have a copy of these slides, and we'll make them available to you as well. But you can also see where some of the other players are out there with their own unique business cases. And that's the key caveat with these. They all have kind of their own unique cases in many cases on that end. I also want to include our latest launch activity. So for anybody quoting business, obviously you're tethered to new launch activity. Or if you've got tooling you're working on, obviously you've got to be cognizant of that as well. We've seen kind of a sluggish amount of launch activity here recently over the last couple of years because of COVID, in part because of COVID. That's about ready to start ratcheting up. 2023 is going to be a big year for launches, 41 vehicle launches. Majors are all news. And it's going to stay lofty for the next several years, above 30 vehicles launching. Now, this includes some of those electrified vehicles, to be sure, but also redesigned internal combustion vehicles. So that activity is getting ready. And in fact, if you're quoting on business, you're likely already starting to see these RFQs come across your desk. If you're working on tooling, you're probably already working on these programs, as it were. So there's a lot of activity coming down the pike. Now, a couple slides on electrification. I don't want to, I want to make sure I'm fully covering this, because the tail of the tape is starting to evolve somewhat. Model count, left-hand part of the slide. This is from a North American production perspective. In 2021, we had about 16 vehicles produced in North America that were fully electric. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's going to the moon. 2026, we have about 117 models being produced in North America that are electrified, fully electric vehicles. Now, our volume, which is the line, is going up, and you'll see we're going to approach 6 million units by 2030. That's no small feat. That's a healthy clip. We can even debate, some of the assumptions in there, to be sure, and what if one knob turns one way versus the other. There's going to be a sizable amount of volume. It's the right-hand side of the slide that's concerning, particularly for our supplier clients. When you look at the volume per nameplate, that's that blue line. Again, in 2019, there's about 60,000 vehicles per nameplate being produced that are battery electric. Your average internal combustion engine runs about 85 to 90,000 vehicles per nameplate. You think about some of those pickup truck programs, well north of that, averages out to be 85 to 90,000 units. Boy, when we start seeing this inflection upward on model count, though, as you get out to 2023 and 2024, we're going to be about 30,000 units per nameplate. That has big implications for suppliers that are used to hundreds of thousands of parts a year. That may force some hard decisions in terms of line allocation, tooling changes, adding more flexibility into your line, and frankly, changing up some of your pricing structure as well to reflect some of those other costs. It will improve, and we do expect to start to see that inflect upward, but it's going to improve as the adoption curve starts to improve. And that's really predicated in this slide. When we take a look at North America versus Europe and Greater China, what does that full battery electric adoption curve look like? In 2020, we were at about 3% in terms of vehicle production. We're fully electric, and that's that pastel green. 2025, we do see it growing to about 15%, with CAFE requirements. We see those California CARB states, California and those 11, 12 other states that are really jumping on board with a zero emission vehicle strategy. 15, and that's about 33% of vehicle sales, by the way. We do feel that 15% by 2025 is going to be certainly doable. And then by 2030, 34%. Now, these are static forecasts. They also are predicated on an improvement in the charging infrastructure, improvement in battery pricing and battery efficiency and charging efficiency. So some of those assumptions are baked in, but there is a trajectory. We do see there's a trajectory, but again, that model count is very critical. When you look at Europe, it's growing even more, 56% by 2030. The CO2 emission requirements coming out of Europe are particularly stringent and clearly auguring towards more of a zero emission future. Greater China, very similar, a different pathway to get there perhaps at times with subsidies and maybe other support or requirements kicking in. But certainly they're on that path as well, something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on. Just to wrap it up before I turn it over to Beth for some Q&A, again, some of this is obvious. Volatility, obviously, we're living through volatile times right now, and it's remaining volatile. Again, I think we're seeing some incremental improvements in certain areas, but we've got to keep our eyes, obviously, on. We're by no means through the full storm. We're just starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps, is probably the best analogy. As we continue on through this, though, we're still watching for component shortages. Labor availability is still a challenge. Raw material pricing, volatility, supplier distress. We're starting to see more and more signs of supplier distress, so something to keep our eyes on as well. We still expect the market to get back to a more normalized pace, to be sure, where growth rates maybe decline, but get to be at least more steady. Emphasis is on certainly electrification, safety, and autonomous technologies. Scale is going to be more important than ever, and we've said that for some time. It's going to become even more important in the midst of all these models that are launching, and that's the challenge, to try to get on vehicle architectures, not just on single programs, because of the challenges and because of the model count proliferation and the competitive intensity between models as well. And then we do think we're going to see more consolidation and collaboration, both within the supply chain and frankly at the automaker level as well. And watch too, I think one of the things the industry is learning more through this whole COVID situation and frankly through the supply chain pressures beyond that is a more localized supply chain is a good thing. It's not always the push the easy button and send it abroad to get it sourced from low-cost country and and all of those other euphemisms. They sound great, in theory, until you've got to put it on a ship and have that ship waiting amongst 100 other ships on the port of Long Beach. It sounds great until you have labor costs going through the roof in some of these emerging markets. There is a benefit to having at least a greater portion of your supply base more localized. And when I say localized here, certainly in North America, that makes US, Canada, Mexico all certainly ripe opportunities on that front, and certainly opportunities for suppliers on this call. With that, I will turn it over to Beth for some Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Mike. There has been, we have a few Q&As, a couple chats I see, and I'm not sure I think the chat and the Q&A, one of them might have been answered later on in your presentation, but I found it really interesting. By the way, guys, I have a new Ford Mach-E, so all electric Ford. And I could see so much as when you were talking, first of all, the number of chips. I mean, there's 100 computers or so in this car versus the typical 300. So you got 3 times as many in there. It makes it more complicated. Cracks me up. Service doesn't even know how to operate it or do a lot of things. I said, how do I open up the rear hatch? They didn't know. So I figured out I had to show them. But, and then you talk about the different, and I'm talking a little bit so it gives people time to put in more Q&As to the extent they want to. But, great point about the changes with battery electric vehicles and their parts. I mean, a lot of the people on here are either part suppliers or they service parts. They plate them, etc. So they might have less nuts and bolts to finish, for example, or to make or to stamp. So, I mean, that's a big thing that everybody's going to have to think about. And
Right.
Car rentals was another great point to you that you've made, because car rentals, where it used to be $60 a day is now 100, or, kind of that ratio. It's gotten crazy, and they're holding on to their cars longer, so it's older. So now once we get the chats going and the chips going and stuff, maybe we'll see some new cars and stuff there. So, all right, with that, I'm going to go to one that was just posted that said, who do you anticipate being the winners and the losers in the electric vehicles? And it's only because it was right smack in front of me and we're kind of talking about it.
It's a great question. I'll tell you, and the strategies have been evolving. I'll use Ford and GM as sort of poster children for this. So GM has been pretty forthright, I think, very early on. It's kind of a vertically integrated strategy. And, they learned from Volt, they learned from Bolt back in the day. But let's face it, this technology is rapidly evolving. So even with that early leader strategy, that doesn't mean they've won the game by any means, but that Ultium platform is a very, very solid strategy, skateboard platform, architecture type of deployment and vertical integration. I kind of like that strategy for them, especially in this intermediate term. They may not be first to market with some of this, and that's where you're seeing vis-a-vis Ford. What's going to happen? Ford's launching their F-150 Lightning this year. They're getting first to market with that, and kudos to them. They were able to find a way to bring that electrification strategy or technology into an existing platform. So early mover strategy, that's great. But then even Ford's starting to evolve some of their strategy around more vertical integration, which I think that vertically integrated strategy is probably a sound one. Again, it's all going to come down to great product. That's a big deal. You mentioned Mach-E. That Mach-E is done phenomenally well, and when you look at it on reviews out there, it competes head to head, with the Model 3, and it competes very well with Model 3 and maybe even Model Y to some extent, probably more Model 3 than anything, and gets very strong reviews on it. It's a great offering that Ford came to market with. So we need to see more of that kind of product in execution. So I certainly wouldn't count out Ford or GM in that front. I think what Volkswagen's doing, with their ID lineup, if you will, looks pretty good as well. You've got a lot of new startups coming to market, and I know we're being asked to quote on a lot of new business from the startups. And we're not bearish on all startups by any stretch. And Tesla's proven that point in spades to their great credit. I think Rivian's had a very solid strategy, and again, have taken a lot of the really good strengths that Tesla has executed on, and maybe even improved on maybe some of their weaknesses that Tesla's had, at least in the past. So Lucid is one I'm a little bit, I don't know if I'd say concerned about, but in terms of volume, in order to really kind of inflect that volume higher, you need to really have a fully blown out lineup, and they're getting there, and they do have a lot of stuff in the hopper, to be sure. But that's one to watch. Stellantis is certainly out there, and it has been making a lot more waves recently on electrification. It's sort of a tortoise and hare kind of thing. Who's going to win if they don't spend the money now, and then they kind of develop lessons learned from everybody else? Is that going to be the strategy that wins? We need to see maybe a bit more on the electrified front coming out of Stellantis. I wouldn't count them out though. just because they have been executing very well on their internal combustion. Much credit to them on Jeep as an example, with new Grand Cherokee, Wagoneer, Grand Wagoneer. They've shown what they can do with product. And that's been a consistent theme for Stellantis and sort of legacy Chrysler Jeep Ram side.
I think once we get more of the chargers around the country, that's going to be a big help too. Because
that's a big deal. You know, the Biden administration with the infrastructure package, you have 500,000 in the hopper. It's going to take some time, of course. We think we probably need as an industry in the US or North America about 1.5 million in terms of external chargers. Now that does not reflect the 80% of us roughly that have a carport or a garage or the ability to charge in some sort of facility at home, if you will. So that's a key component of this as well. But external or public chargers are a critical part of this, to be sure.
Thank you. You know, one question that was raised, and I'll go back to what I saw, like the F-150s in parking lots all over Detroit area or all over Michigan, all waiting for their chips.
Yeah.
And some of them, a lot of them are still there. And they're 2021s. Well, now we're in 2022. So what happens to those cars? And also, will some of them be junk because they've been sitting there and they've been flooded, rained on, what have you? So what's your thoughts on?
Yeah, it's a great question. In full disclosure, it's been a challenging one to put numbers to. There's not a lot of visibility on this other than the anecdotal, which we all see. I've seen it myself. You drive by these holding pens near the plant or even outside of the, away from the plant where they've had leased property. And it's not any one automaker. It's dang near everybody at various stages have been doing these partial builds. It's been more heavily weighted to the Detroit 3 to a more significant extent, but in Europe, Volkswagen, even over in China, it's been a fair amount of that going on. Now, we do think a lot of that partial build activity did get completed at the back end of last year in Q4, really going into November, December. A lot of that has been kind of built out, especially those 21s, those earlier built models. But the challenge is anytime you have a shortage, what happens is you still end up getting some pockets, some builds, if you will. So some of them may not be as old as we think. It's just that we keep seeing a fairly sizable amount. It's just there's been some churn in there. From a demand perspective, I think the demand will be there. Again, we have to assume that the vehicles are sound and saleable. Maybe that's a stretch, but I do think automakers are taking the measures needed to make sure to keep them protected, if you will. But by the same token, if we assume they are saleable, the demand will be there. Now, maybe they have to make some slight incentives or something along those lines to kind of sweeten the deal if it's still a 2021 versus a 22. But by no means, this is not an optimal strategy. And the automakers know this too. It's incredibly inefficient because you're building these vehicles almost effectively twice, or you're throwing more labor at these vehicles twice. And that's not a way to go about doing it. But in the absence of that, you kind of got to do what you got to do. Like I said, incrementally, it's getting better, but there's still pockets of weakness on that front. We are still seeing some of those partial builds out there, to be sure.
Thanks. Well, so we were talking about chip shortages. I'm going to turn a little bit to battery shortages as well. I'm on the National NATBAT, which is the National Association for Batteries. And, we have this recycle committee that I'm active in. We also we need to build some battery factories here in the US. And Michigan, for one, is really pushing hard for some of these battery factories and doing it. And the question kind of focuses on that and the concern about China, its battery production. Is there a global risk of battery shortages with China holding its purse strings?
Oh, there certainly is. And now I will say we have got, and you've alluded to some of that with General Motors and their investments in Michigan, Ford with their investments in Kentucky and in Tennessee. There's a lot more battery development going on here in North America and even in Europe. It does help to counter some of that, perhaps I would argue, as it relates to China. But there are multiple levels to this question. There's the battery pack, then there's the raw materials. And raw materials are another question entirely. And we've got our energy practice looks very focused into the raw material side. And when we look at lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, all the big inputs, there are, we feel, enough resources kind of underground, in ground. The reserves are there, but it becomes sort of a kind of a discussion around, remember, if you do historical research, the old Standard Oil days, way back in the day, getting the minerals out of the ground and then processing them and then getting them ready for battery usage. That could end up becoming more of a choke point than even just the proven reserves. And the fact that we still have a lot of these raw materials coming out of not so safe or savory places, not so conducive to that as well. So it is a challenge. Now, again, because we do have sort of that glide path, if you will, some of that glide path may be informed and governed by some of these challenges, but by the same token, it also does give us the ability to ramp up to that. But to be sure, this is top of mind for all automakers in the industry as a whole, because we're not start hitting the ground with day one today having enough battery capacity that we need for, say, 2025 or 2026. We need to grow into that. And there's a lag time to that, and a lead time. And that's what we're going through right now.
Yeah, there's a big focus. And you also answered some of the other questions on batteries and, the raw materials and such at the same time. So thank you for covering a few different things with one. But talking again about China, et cetera, tariffs, we implemented the tariffs in the US. And the thought was we want to increase the production in the US, kind of shore up, the automotive sector here. Has it worked?
Yes and no. That's it. That's been a particularly, if I'm talking like sheet steel and some of the steel categories, that was a problem last year in particular, especially went into the early part of last year. We saw anybody who was in the steel business. I know there's a lot of folks on the line that were at least, either getting some pass-through or direct costs associated with that. We saw some really tough and tight capacity within the steel space. And it was sluggish in terms of coming back online. Now, in talking to our steel analysts, because it's something that we've been tracking quite a bit, we have seen some improvement in a lot of those steel categories in terms of, on the one hand, production starting to increase a bit further, and then some of the other imports outside of even China helping to fill in some of those gaps as well. That helped to create a little bit more of a balance with pricing, as it were. Electrical steel, I'll throw out there, though, is still a big concern for us. Electrical steel is particularly used in electric motors and some of those EV categories, in addition to industrial applications. So again, there's some pressure there that could create some, I don't want to say it's going to be the same kind of scenario that semiconductors is. I don't think it's quite to that level of magnitude, but it's something we have to keep our eye on. And it's this continuous challenge of kind of a whack-a-mole from one supply constraint to the next. But on steel, it does feel like in many of those categories, it has improved. And we've even seen that improvement showing in some of those key categories from a pricing standpoint. We're not fully there yet, but it has been improving.
Interesting. Now I have a question, and you probably will understand this better than me. They wanted you to talk a little bit about Intel's FAB plan in Ohio and what percentage of its capacity will be for auto. Do you know about it?
Which plant was it? I didn't catch it.
Intel's FAB.
Oh, the Intel chip facility. Oh, that's a good, boy. I do not know the percentage. That's a great, and I don't know that our semiconductor team is full. What they have told us, and in talking to them, that it's a net positive for automotive. So there will be gains, but to the best of my knowledge, and when I talk to them, our team, it certainly isn't 100. It's not all automotive. It is definitely going to be shared amongst a variety of consumer electronics and autos, but we are viewing that as a net positive, certainly to automotive, and it will be a benefit, but I do not have the percentage breakdown on that. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. And this one is in the chat section instead of the Q&A. And it says, is IHS Markit going to develop a forecast for e-powertrain battery platforms similar to engine forecasts? I guess you kind of did, didn't you?
We do, and we do have that, and they're in different areas of our forecast. So if this is somebody who is kind of versed with our forecast, I will say it's in a bit of a different area, and it's something that we're working on even as we speak. So in our powertrain forecast, we still call it powertrain. Maybe that evolves to propulsion or something. We do call out if it's a internal combustion engine or a battery electric vehicle and so forth. And then we do have a separate forecast that goes in deep into those alternative propulsion technologies. So the battery type, the e-motor type, power electronics is another big one as well. So we absolutely do have coverage on, pretty extensive coverage. And so feel free to reach out to me. I'll get you information on that. Happy to do so.
Okay.
Down to the model level. And in some cases, even the supplier, the tier 1 supplier that's involved.
Great. Thank you. And Shannon thanks you on that too. Now, the next question goes to your slide 18.
Okay.
And in that slide, there was optimism. It says, why are you so optimistic if you compare it to the base? So, and I'm not sure if you answered that or not, because you talked about electric and how that's, the adoption it takes for electric.
Yeah, so a couple different things. It depends, if we're talking about the actual scenarios, or in slide 18 where we talk about, like the performance of the US as an example. I tell you, the inherent optimism on either our optimistic scenario or, the potential to inflect upward is, here we see this goes out through 2026. I'll tell you, 2023, 24, and even into 25, this sales tailwind is real. There is, even with, and I get it, inflation is going to be a problem, and is a problem already. Interest rates going up will be a problem, and they will go up in the not too distant future. And we're already starting to feel those effects. But even with that said, we've undersold the market for the last 2 years, 2020 and 21. And more importantly, we continue to severely undersell the market even to this day. That, our forecast pre-COVID for 2020, as an example, was somewhere in the order of low 16 million unit range in terms of vehicle sales, and we sold 14.6. Again, last year we sold 15.1. Our forecast would have been probably close to 16.5 million. So again, these aren't one-for-one benefits per se, but we do feel they are transferable. And again, going back to throw some additional numbers around the daily rental category as an example, we sell close to 2 million units in a normal year to daily rental. In its depth, we were below 1 million. So that daily rental, we feel, is going to give us something of a tailwind, and it's not been satisfied even as we speak. We're still underselling, not to the level of below 1 million units, but still underselling to daily rental. So some of that that gives us some additional, again, support and confidence. Now, we can create downward scenarios around a recession. We're not baking a recession into our forecast, but it's a fair point. Well, that's a mighty big assumption to not be calling on a recession. And I guess in some ways it can be, but we have alternative scenarios that do look at a more of a recessionary environment. Stagflation takes off. We have broader inflation pressures, consumer confidence collapse, and it has this cascading effect. To be sure, that will seriously impact that upside on sales and that pent-up demand. And we have an alternative scenario along those lines as well. But those are some of the positives that certainly we're keeping an eye on, but also the negatives, frankly, as well.
So great. Well, Mike, we're right on the money on time. So thank you very much. As always, your talks are always so informative and such. We greatly appreciate it. Absolutely. And also, as Jonathan mentioned, in a couple of days, his presentation and a recording of this the whole speech, the whole presentation, plus the PowerPoints will be on our website. In addition, it will be on the Michigan chapter of the National Association's website as well. And if you have any questions or follow-up, you should not hesitate to reach out to me, and I can connect you with Mike, and we can go from there. And then Jonathan, you can put my my email address, and I guess Mike's too, if that's okay, in the chat.
Absolutely.
Chat, so you have them.
Hey, I did catch in the chat, because I didn't have the chat active on mine when I was showing my screen, asked about the scenarios, the base being larger than the optimistic in certain years. It's a very valid question. I should have even alluded to that early on. We take these scenarios, we run them as of time zero being this year. So in this year, when in an optimistic and pessimistic, even in the pessimistic scenario, eventually that sales would start to recover and take off. So it would defer the production recovery further out. So it can have the effect of your pessimistic scenario, even outstripping your base case or your optimistic that would have been an optimistic scenario 4 years hence. I don't know, I'm probably butchering that somewhat, but that's some of the nuance in there. We're fully cognizant of the fact that those scenarios as you go further out are a little odd looking, but that's why.
Great.
Sorry about that. I had to throw that in there.
No, you know, I saw that follow-up. So Paul, thank you for the
No
clarification. And then thank you, Mike, for adding that one on there. So great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now what you've all been waiting for, those nasty terms and conditions. Because what we see, and we've been seeing, is that you don't realize it when you are when you have a purchase agreement or you agree to do some work for somebody, you don't realize that automatically you're agreeing to their terms and conditions. It's on their website. It's like, what? And who reads all those terms and conditions? I mean, have you seen how long they are and how complicated? Well, the answer is we read them. And because we have to advise you, we have to watch, what the difference are so that you understand them, understand what you're agreeing to. And there's some things that, they will change. So you need to negotiate that. And to help us understand what the new Stellantis terms and conditions are, we have Everardo Tapia. And Everardo is recently joined Butzel. He's in our automotive business and commercial litigation section, and along with our intellectual property IP groups. And he comes to us from another state, so that's kind of cool, where he was really focusing on not only clients in the automotive industry, but also telecommunications and energy companies, because he has a bachelor's in petroleum and natural gas engineering from Pennsylvania State University. And then he went to law school in Chicago, but then while he was there, and he has a lot of background there, somehow he got his license to practice law in still another state, Missouri. So now he's in Michigan. He has a very heavy background in Mexico. So I think a lot of you know that we do a lot of work for facilities in Mexico as well, because let's face it, automotive suppliers, a lot of them have facilities in Mexico. So that is another bonus that we have with Everardo. So with that kind of introduction of him, I am going to switch over the controls to you and go for it. Terms and conditions.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Beth. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Like you said, this presentation is going to be focusing on the Stellantis and FSC terms and conditions, but really more broadly, it's going to be a refresher or a primer about supply chain contracting, right? Like she said, we get these terms and conditions and nobody reads them, whether it's for your iPhone or for any other terms and conditions, and nobody reads them. But like she said, we do. And so here at Butzel, we have a team that is dedicated to reading, that has analyzed and has read the Stellantis terms and conditions, and of which there have been significant changes in 2022. And so what I want to do today, though, is speak broadly about contracts, contract information, and contract terms. That way you guys can be prepared for contract negotiations, whether it's, with one of the big Detroit 3, or whether it's with one of these new startups or transplant OEM that Mike Wall presented on earlier, right? So I think I wanted to start, though, by saying, as a disclaimer, of course, these are not, this is not legal advice, but what I would encourage everyone to do is to seek counsel, whether you have an in-house counsel attorney or whether you use us or someone else as outside counsel. There are plenty of reasons why you could get into trouble if you don't know what it is that you're signing and what it is that you're agreeing to.
But of course, they're going to use Butzel. I mean, because
of course,
Butzel.
Yes.
I mean, we are the automotive law firm, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
There you go.
And so I encourage everyone to reach out to myself, to reach out to Beth, to reach out to any one of our team who is in the automotive industry group. We're very easy to find on the internet. And so for this presentation, though, here's a little bit of a roadmap just to guide everyone. And of course, we're not going to have time to go through all of the changes. We've had a number of presentations already about all of the different Stellantis terms and conditions, changes that have happened for 2022. And of course, they're significant, and each one of those has different legal repercussions, and it depends on your business model and your business case. And so that's why it's very important to seek counsel. And so we're going to use the Stellantis, the FCC new terms and conditions as sort of a case study to see how it is that some OEMs, and I want to get the wording right, some OEMs and people on the other side of the contract use one extreme one-sided terms that just they want to stick it to you, right? And if you let them, they're going to. And so that's why I want to make sure that you guys are aware and knowledgeable and prepared to best defend your case and to best negotiate when it comes to contracts. So like you said, so we're going to start with contracts. So what is a contract? A contract, it could be a lot of things, and that's what makes it very difficult. A contract, right, could be the RFQ, the sourcing letter, purchase order, emails, of course, the terms and conditions. It could be any other number of documents that are incorporated by reference, such as drawings, specs, standards, packaging guidelines, of course. And of course, the contract could, quote unquote, change, although it's not a change necessarily, but new terms could be added with a new purchase order, or if an OEM such as Stellantis updates their terms and conditions as they have this year on either their portal or their website. So the contract does include those. And so here we look at what Stellantis has one of the things that they've changed for this year is that they have at least two sets of terms and conditions that they use. They use the global terms, and then they use local terms here in North America. We have the North American terms and conditions. And yeah, it includes a whole bunch of other documents similar to the ones that I just mentioned generally, but the North American terms for anybody contracting with them would be considered the master agreement, and the purchase orders would be considered the final agreement. And again, all of these different documents are incorporated into the contract. And so all of the terms in all of these documents are things that you would be bound by. So it's very important. And so we have one of the other changes that they have made is that they are allowed to unilaterally extend the term of the contract. They are, they're allowed to extend it from time to time. They are allowed to, at its sole discretion, add vehicle programs, extending the life of the contract that you have with them. So it really creates a situation where your responsibilities are not well defined, and so that creates risks for you. So with all these different terms that that could be added, how does a person entering or company entering into a contract accept or reject a contract? Well, we have different ways in which someone can accept and enter into the contract. And so we taking a look at previous FCA terms and conditions. So there are different ways in which somebody can accept and enter into the contract. You could acknowledge that you're entering into the contract explicitly. You could perform work. You could deliver the goods that you're selling. And so, yeah, so if a seller delivers the product, then you are, entering into the contract, and then you would be bound by that contract. And sometimes it is important to know that, acceptance could occur without knowledge. It could occur without necessarily intent, right? So, if you don't necessarily intend to enter into a contract, but you do something that shows performance of the contract, you would be bound by that contract because you've accepted the contract. And another equally perplexing, legal theory is that you could theoretically accept a contract and be bound by a contract if you don't reject it timely. And so, here we see from the Honda 2012 terms and conditions, if you don't reject the terms of the contract within a certain period, you would be bound by the contract. As far as the Stellantis terms and conditions, there are several ways of accepting a contract. On the supplier portal, if you were to go in and accept the RFQ, or if you were to accept the entering into the portal, one of the I haven't done this myself, so you'll excuse me, but if what I understand is if you click accept and hit OK, right, much like the iPhone terms and conditions or the iTunes terms and conditions, if you hit accept just by hitting OK, you are, of course, bound by them. And so a lot of times, you need to hit accept, hit OK to even view the purchase order that you're trying to submit a quote for, or that you're trying to fulfill. And so you could be bound by purchase order, even though you just hit OK just to be able to see the purchase order. And so that, definitely could create some risk, right, for you if you don't know that. Some other changes that we see for this year for Stellantis is that they have really created a one-side type of terms and conditions, in that they explicitly say in their new terms and conditions that the other party, the seller or supplier, although they refer to their suppliers as sellers, just to be clear, they say that sellers may not offer terms and conditions that are different, right? And so these are the types of things that they have sprinkled throughout. And they say that if you propose any terms, they are deemed rejected. And so this is definitely something that's troubling, right, to say the least. And so we just want to make everybody aware that this type of thing does occur, whether it's in Stellantis or it could be with someone else. And of course, so the next question is, can there be amendments or changes to the contract? And I think I answered this a little bit already, but the answer is generally no, although there are some caveats, right? So whenever you change the contract, theoretically, or whenever you propose a change to a contract, it becomes a new contract or a side agreement, right? It becomes a new offer, and it has to be, you have to have a new acceptance. And so, so that's why you can't just generally, just change willy-nilly, unilaterally from one side change a contract, but purchase orders are considered part of the contract. And thus, if you have a new purchase order, that you are trying to fulfill, then that is a new document that you're going to be bound by, and that one will be based off of and will be bound by the terms and conditions that apply at the time the purchase order was accepted or written, right, depending on the terms within the purchase order. So it's really important for people to know that. Again, within the FCA Stellantis terms and conditions, we see clauses which state that FCA may amend just on their own these terms and conditions at any time, right? And so again, it makes it really one-sided, and it does it, and also prevents the seller from changing it explicitly. And so moving on to the next section. So we have, so typically, you know, in a contract, what you'd like to do or rather what normally happens is that the buyer volume estimates are not binding, right? So volume fluctuates, but pricing is usually fixed. So one of the things that we encourage our clients to do is to consider using formulas that take into account the different volatility and fluctuations that might exist in the market. The previous presenter kind of put it on black and white, and it said that there are different projections, and so we encourage our customers to in their contracts consider all of these mechanics, right? We encourage them to use automatic price fluctuations to protect yourself. It's and make it as simple as possible. Although adding, the more you add it, the more you consider, the more complex it gets. But if you can tie it to an index, or if you can tie it to, if you can make it so you can adjust the frequency, to whatever situation works for you, then you're in a better position. So again, FCA, what happens with their pricing terms? They say that the seller must pass to FCA all direct or indirect cost decreases. There are changes to payment term, of course. Seller cannot mark up the cost at any time, and you can't assign if your situation changes. At the same time, what we encourage our clients to do is, although price increases are not usually are not usually allowed, or so to speak, right? A lot of suppliers still request them, and it's important to have that that communication with your customers. It's important to have a good understanding with them, but it's also really important to have these types of terms in your contract, so that none of this is a surprise, and so that you can, if needed, request those price increases, and those can be negotiated in good faith. With that said, some of the other terms that are important in a contract are the warranty and indemnity contracts, right? What it is that you're warranting whenever you're selling or you're supplying a part or service, right? And so we encourage our clients to only warrant what it is that you provide, right? To be explicit, to be as precise, and to also to provide to provide disclaimers, right? That your products are fit for a particular purpose. And so if you limit what it is that you're warranting, and as narrow as possible, with being reasonable, of course, then I think it puts you in a good position to then, if something were to happen, then to be protected. And so at FCA, of course, as you guys are starting to see a trend. They in their terms and conditions, they really put the seller in a bad position, where make it almost really impossible for them to be able to really to really predict what it is that might happen in the future. But they do assume that that any event in the future is foreseeable by the seller, and of course they want you to take all the risk that comes with that. And of course, I mean, obviously don't read this. This is just to show you what the old warranty terms look like and what the new warranty terms look like. And you can see that they've really increased their responsibilities that they've put on the sellers.
I was just going to say, I like the graphic from the slide before that.
Yeah, of course.
But then you have the comparison, just the number of words between the two, but was it 3 times
Absolutely.
as many words?
Yeah.
And more than that, 4
right.
times. So
yeah,
good graphic.
Yep. And so some examples just to show the audience, right? That they'd wish they not wish, but they mandate that the goods will be fit for any purpose contemplated by FCA, whether or not it was communicated or whether or not the seller is responsible for that design, right? It also says that design will be defect free. Again, even if the seller is not responsible for design, that the goods will comply with all current and future laws and policies, as if the seller knows what future laws are going to happen. And of course, that the price will somehow at the same time still remain competitive. I guess I'll put in, since we're running a little low on time, there will be time for a few minutes for question and answer. And Dan Bressman, who is with us, he, if you'd be kind enough to answer some of the questions that might come up, on the Q&A. And also, I wanted to say that we have a full analysis of these terms and conditions on our website. And so, if I'm scrolling way through fast, there's some of these. These are more intended as examples. And so, we just want to show you the kinds of things to look out for. So with the new terms and conditions, FCA is looking, of course, for greater indemnity obligations. No surprise there. But they even go so far as to say that that the seller might be responsible for soft losses, which might include the nebulous lost business or lost opportunity. And their incorrect instructions or specifications would not be a defense. And so what are to close out, what are some best practices, right, in negotiating, what are some best practices in contracting, right? And so this is the negotiating phase when you're documented, whenever you are in the contract, and mitigating if something were to occur. So in the negotiation phase, you want to remember that leverage does make a big difference. You have to be prepared. You have to know the terms that you agree to. You have to know about your product, and you have to know about the market. And that's why being part of this group is just so incredible, that where the trends are, and where your product stands, and where the industry is at large. And so you wanted to develop a strategy early, right? Review the terms, attachments, references. You want to be an expert, and you want, of course, your counsel to be experts as well, right? And that's why we're here, right? That's why Butzel is here. We've reviewed not only these terms and conditions, but others as well. We're familiar with them, and we also know the business, right? So at the same time, we want to know what is your unique situation. And again, even if you don't use us, your counselor should know what is your unique situation when it comes to getting into a contract. And then also, one of the things I want to highlight is that you have to know when to walk away, right? And this comes with knowing the business, right? If it's not going to work out for you, if there's no way that you can be profitable, if they're asking you to take too much risk, then you should know to walk away. And so that's a hard proposition, right? But we feel like we have to give you just the honest truth, and sometimes that's what that means. Obviously, the business decision to walk away will be entirely yours, but we can give you the best arguments on both sides.
I was going to say, because we're a little bit running out of time,
okay.
And there's a couple things. First, there are some people that are not doing, this is good general information about, understanding your deal and when you might want to walk away from it. Also documentation, that's huge, guys. Please document. Actually, we kind of like when you don't document because it gives us tons and tons of work. But seriously, document things, document what you agree on, your prices, whatever. It's so important. And, but some people on this call are not doing business with Stellantis. Maybe they're doing business with the tier one that is doing business with Stellantis. So they're not directly contracting with them. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. And that's why, you know, it's important to know the terms and conditions, no matter who it is on the other side, right? So that's why it's important to have such good counsel, because you really need to know what it is that you're getting into, and you really need to know who the other one is, who the other party is, and know the business really well. But I think the other thing is that though some of the members of this organization might not be tier one suppliers to Stellantis, they might be sub suppliers, right? They might be tier 2 or 3 or 3. And so one of the interesting things about terms and conditions is that they mandate that the terms and conditions, right, get passed down to sub suppliers. And so even though you might not necessarily be directly dealing with Stellantis, you might be bound by all of these terms and conditions. And that's really important. But again, even if you're not in that chain, then it's still super important to know what it is that, how it is to best negotiate any contract that you're getting into, understand all of the terms that are in the deal. And yeah, like Beth said, documenting everything when you're in the bound by the contract, right? So if you're bound by a contract to deliver a certain number of goods, and you need to document those types of things in your efforts, just like the slide says. Yeah, just document everything so that you can then use it if anything were to happen.
Now, there's another. So the other thing is that we've been encouraging everyone to understand the terms and conditions, and which ones you can live with and which ones you can't. And there are some of the terms that whoever the OEM is, including Stellantis, has been willing to make some minor modifications. Have they been willing to negotiate side letters, or, what kind of I know these are brand new, so you might not have the answer to this, but what kind of modifications have you seen?
Well, there have been some modifications in terms of which terms and conditions apply. We know that some of the terms state that the new terms and conditions apply to any existing purchase order that already exists. And so there have been some modifications that say, no, what we really intend is for these terms and conditions to be applicable moving forward. But really, I think the core of the question is, can you get some modifications? Can a customer get modifications with Stellantis or with anybody else? And the answer is, it really needs to be something that is done individually, right? It needs to be, you need to have someone or yourselves, if you'd like, analyze what it is that you're bound by currently, analyze what your business situation is, and be able to make those requests individually depending on your business case. And that varies by the person, right? Each person is, has their own needs and what it is that they can request, and how much, and how necessary it is for them to request, right? So if it's imperative, right, that they request certain changes, then that can be looked at for sure.
Right. And then Paul was nice enough to add another comment for this one. You've been active, Paul. We appreciate it. And he mentioned that OESA met with Stellantis, and Stellantis reminded people that this is effective January 1st, 2022. So just that's a good reminder, good thing to tell everybody. So, and what he also said is that they mentioned that does not apply to changes on existing programs. So I would still confirm that. I mean, they say that, and we need to watch it and make sure. So when you do that, but no, for those of you who have a contract for something you're doing right now, then, you know, you have that contract. It's for when you have something new for them, a new launch, etc. That's where this kicks in, or a new product. So just, you should always keep an eye on that.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, they say that, of course, right? But it's one thing for them to put it in an email, or for somebody from their purchasing department to say that, right? But that's not, you know, that's not good enough in the eyes of the law, or a lot of times it's not good enough in the eyes of the law. And so what needs to happen, and what I encourage everybody to do, is to you know, seek counsel and to take a look at your individual situations, and to, you know, and to see how or if, you know, you need to respond.
Right. And we are out of time. I want to thank all of you. Thank Vibrato for, you know, his presentation. He's got some information on this last page for you to follow up on if you want to see some of our analysis on this. Again, this is on our website. We have great resources on our website. If you guys haven't looked at it, and, you know, we've done this for GM and for others, and if you haven't seen the analysis and things to watch out for, you should really check out this resource, because it is excellent. Our website is really good.
Yeah, I want to thank the team. I want to thank the analysis team. Their names are here, and I'll encourage everybody to go to the website. And I will also remind people that if you ask the question, whether on the Q&A or the chat, that we will absolutely get back to you and answer those questions. And if you want to, and if you have further follow-up questions after this, you know where to reach us.
Yeah, just email me and I'll get it to Everardo and the rest of the team, so that we can answer some of your questions and get you in line. And again, I want to thank the Michigan Association, the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Surface Finishers, and some of our board members are on, and our National Association of Surface Finishers, and some of your members are on, and then a whole bunch of other people that are affiliated with Butzel, you know, clients, etc. that are on. It's great to see your names, and we've been communicating with a few of you. And we welcome any comments that you may have on this program, how it went, what we could do better, what we should keep doing. And again, you'll get this recording on our website. Give us a couple days, because that's how long it usually takes. And thank you, everybody. This ends our program right on time. Well, a little late, 3 minutes late. Thank you.